All right, so here on my left we have Chuck Howell, Chief Scientist for Dependable AI at MITRE Corp. In the middle we have Jean Vettel, the Senior Science Lead in the Future Soldier Technologies Division under the Army Research Laboratories. And on my far left we have Jeff Shilling, Acting CIO of the National Cancer Institute. So we're going to talk about AI and how its technologies are impacting healthcare in and outside the clinical setting. So I first just want to go through each of you and talk about a brief description of what it is you do, your focus areas, and your position. We'll start with you, Chuck.
Sure.
Yes, please.
Can you hear me? Yes. Step forward, Tin Man. I've always wanted to do that. Thank you very much. Quit while you're ahead. I work at a company called MITRE. We're a .org. We're a not-for-profit. We have about 8,000 engineering technical staff. And we work across all different parts of the federal government. We actually manage 7 what are called federally funded research and development centers. That's fairly tedious, but what's interesting to me about it is it gives me the opportunity to, at least temporarily, appear a lot smarter than I am, because I'm in a tech center that's supporting autonomy and artificial intelligence adoption across essentially all of the government, all of the federal government, some state and local, et cetera. So we get the opportunity on our good days to take a lesson learned, a challenge or an opportunity from the healthcare community, for example, and apply it to the intelligence community, or something that the Department of Treasury is doing that we think is really promising, and apply it to the VA, et cetera, et cetera. So my focus is on, I'm in a tech center that's focused on autonomy and artificial intelligence, and my particular focus is on dependable AI, how to calibrate the confidence you have in a system, what kind of a roadmap can you lay out to make sure that consequential AI does what you want it to do and not what you don't want it to do. So I'll be employed for another 200 years before that's done. Thanks.
Jean.
Hi, I'm Jean Vettel. I'm a researcher at U.S. Army Research Laboratory. Oh, now I have. And I also have joint appointments at University of Pennsylvania and UC Santa Barbara. So I first want to tell you a little bit about what Army Research Laboratory does. We're the corporate research laboratory for the Army, which our mission is straightforward. Our goal is to do cutting-edge science for breakthrough technologies to make sure that our soldiers can do their peacekeeping missions and keep our nation's sovereignty. You might imagine that the science of the laboratory has made good advancements on, say, armor that's protected our soldiers from IEDs, green bullets to make things environmentally safe, autonomous assets in the air. But today I thought, given this event, that I would tell you about a recent scientific innovation at the lab that actually interfaces technology with biochemistry. So the general problem space that you can think about as a soldier typically carries about half their body weight on their backs, and about 15 pounds of that is batteries. So one of the core research areas within the laboratory is on fuel. And recently, the folks in the colleagues at the lab did an innovation in an aluminum nanomaterial, that essentially mixed with a substance we all carry in our bodies produces fuel, which is urine. And so some of the excitement research in the laboratory, right, is about this idea of how can we find cutting edge technology, right, to really improve performance. So I personally don't work on any of that I just told you about. I personally I'm a neuroscientist, so I work on physiology data, brain data in particular, and if we can use signals from our brain and body to predict something about what the soldier needs at that given moment, and we can use those signals to individualize the way that technology performs to make their performance better. And so we'll talk a little bit about that today in terms of how AI plays a huge role in our vision for how it is that we can take and use physiological signals to improve performance.
Fascinating. Really. The urine. I'm just thinking when my battery goes low on my phone. More. So my name is Jeff Shilling. I've been with the National Cancer Institute for about 15 years. I've worked in the intramural program. About 1/5 of our funding stays here in the NIH campus, and we do research, and the rest goes out to do mostly grants. And so part of it was mentioned about the Precision Medicine Initiative. That's a big piece of what we do. But I wanted to describe to you a little bit more about what cancer is and why AI is such a perfect target for helping us work with it more. So, we've all been impacted by cancer at some level, family members or people we know and or ourselves. And so we get the diagnosis from the doctor, and it has kind of a name, and it has a biological reference to that name, right? And so it's a body part, and it's something wrong with that body part and some kind of long Latin name. And so, and we know that it used to be called, well, we had lung cancer, and now, well, we have non-small cell lung cancer, and now we have non-small cell lung cancer adenoma. So it gets more and more defined. So we don't really think of cancer as one disease anymore. We really think of it as this a very detailed disease. And now we're looking at it much more at the low level, at biochemistry or genetically. So we're looking at what mutations actually are in this disease. So if I say, what's in my lung cancer, it might be the same thing that's in someone else's liver cancer. So we normally, the way the FDA does things, it does it by a disease, and a treatment is disease-based. So we're redefining the disease based upon not just how we do the old pathology, which is what I just mentioned, but now we'll say these 5 genes are being expressed differently than normal cell than they should be. These 5 genes are not being expressed when they should be, and then we have these genetic mutations also happening. We want to use AI to say, what is the best treatment for this specific patient, right? So that's a big thing that we want to do, and it's exactly what was being talked about earlier. It's about getting this data. We don't really have the data. So we really, really, really need that data. We need policy, and as the National Cancer Institute, we're going to be able to create some of that policy. There's a lot of people in this room working on some of these solutions already. I know she's nodding her head from Watson, and so we have, we fund a lot of the work that the cancer centers that they're working with. So we're very excited about this, and we're very excited, I think, to be able to go from kind of the cautious data protections that we have today. We're worried about people misusing that data, to kind of the controlled, freed up. Identity is a big factor for us. So it's a very exciting time for sure.
Wonderful, and we're definitely going to get into dig a little bit deeper into data and personalized treatment. But I wanted to start quickly by asking Chuck if you can explain what exactly consequential AI is and why we should all care about it.
Well, I mean, the discussion this morning is a great example of it. This is why I need artificial intelligence. AI has been around. I worked on a symbolics workstation in Common Lisp in the 20th century, and I walked to school both ways. AI has been around for a long time, but there has been a real obvious inflection point in the last maybe 5 years. And so the advances are remarkable. The demonstrated ability to do things that people who really knew the field would have said is 10 years out, happen 18 months later, over and over again. And some of that is of just clear, unmistakable utility. So what's happening is artificial intelligence in general, machine learning in particular, is being at least considered, if not adopted, in systems where you really care a lot about the outcome, whether it's clinical decision support or estimating the likelihood of recidivism for a parole recommender system, or predictive policing, or the intelligence analytics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, self-driving cars. So there are all these different environments where AI in general, machine learning in particular, is starting to have roles that have real consequences if we get it wrong. And one of the things that I think we just have no intuition for, everybody, AI in general, machine learning, I'll stop saying that, just machine learning, we have no real experience with systems that are simultaneously so powerful and useful and advancing so quickly and yet so brittle and so very, very hard to understand the performance envelope. And the combination of those two things presents some real challenges. And so consequential AI, consequential machine learning is really just about, and dependable AI is just about, what can we put in place so that we have adequate confidence that this consequential system that's going to rely at least in part on machine learning, that we all agree that's a responsible thing to do. Let's go ahead and take advantage of it. So.
All right. Jean, so you have a push for individualized medicine and treatment for soldiers, which starts with collecting data and lots of data. Can you talk about how your work in the lab relates to the health sector, the health industry, outside of the lab?
So first, just let me clarify that Army Research Laboratory, we do not sit under medical command, so I do not have a direct research on healthcare. Do not take my money. We instead work on getting this data for improving the performance of healthy individuals. So what I wanted to kind of pull the thread, which is relevant for healthcare, to be clear, was actually from what you were talking about for this idea of wanting data. You want access to data. So from where I sit, one of the scientific challenges that we have in terms of what data do we need to actually get this, what treatment do you want, the bulk of science for decades, for 100 years, right, has really been focused on looking at group averages. So a lot of the science of how we develop what pharmaceuticals we use, all kinds of treatment plans within health industry, but also in terms of technologies that are built to help healthy individuals, are reliant on this idea that if I have sufficient amount of data from other people, I can look at the average of that response, like in the brain, and predict how you, sir, because I point at people, you, sir, will then what you would need. And that's actually false, right? So a lot of the failure of different technologies in particular to help healthy individuals is because it's not capturing the individual differences between us that matter. So a big push in the laboratory is really focusing on what we call this longitudinal multidimensional measurement, right? Yeah, that's my buzzword of the guess of the day. Which what that means is as we have more of these non-invasive sensors, so wristwatches that can tell us about our wake-sleep profiles, we work on, say, embedding sensors that can be put into hats or helmets that you can wear on your head, and we record brain data continuously and can start analyzing your brain data, heart rate monitors. You get the drift, right? We have all of this wearable sensor technology. So the idea then is if we can start storing wearable sensor technology for a given individual and have that access and using AI, right, to find what it is that that person might need for a treatment. So starting to build on movement away from just the group average approach, right, for cancer solutions, because it works in some and not in others. You go to any healthcare profession ever, right, you're always going to hear that phrase, well, this typically works, but sometimes it does this, right? And so the scientific question is how we can move beyond just studying these averages to get to that. But just to tie into what you just said, that has a lot of important consequences for, let's say in my world, right? My goal is to start using physiology from soldiers long term to have technology that can help them perform, right? So if they're having a good day, bad day, right? The technology can literally adapt to what the soldier needs on that day to stay safe. Well, that becomes a huge consequence in terms of if the technology readout of what that soldier needs on a given day is wrong, that's huge consequence, right? Yeah. So just tying, I feel like we're all sitting sort of in this space where even though I work on a healthy domain, that is very relevant for healthcare.
And are you starting to wrap any AI around the data you're collecting yet? Or
Oh, absolutely, yes. Yeah.
what kinds?
So a lot of, we collect, it's funny, so I just talked about individualized analyses, right? But nonetheless, that still starts from collecting long-term data, either from a given individual or from lots of people to start getting some recognition of how, because if he comes in tomorrow, Chuck comes in tomorrow and says, I need to have a piece of technology, I can't say, well, give me 10 years of your data, buddy, and then I'll start, right? We still have to say, take things from the group data and customize that too. So we have a lot of work within some of the machine learning space to figure out what are the right features to help us figure out similarities between people and then let their own data build and advance from there.
And Jeff, I know we talked about how you're also pushing for data access and more data sources so that you can benefit from the AI technologies and eventually help oncologists with treatments for their patients. Can you talk a little bit about that and the work you said you're doing right now in modeling for that future?
Well, I must say I'm very excited by what you were saying, right? I mean, it's so exciting for me. It's hard for me to even like calm myself to talk here. So, you know, this is not. I think because you know if you're not really if you're kind of a science person, what you really understand is that we really almost know nothing about what's going on. So, and what we have to deal with is basically bias. So we all know that we used to believe that all these things were either environmental or genetic, right? You're either, you were exposed to some toxin and that caused this problem, or you have a genetic predisposition for this. This was the drive for a long time, and all of a sudden, now they're like, well, there's this microbiome, there's these bacteria have a giant impact on what's going on. And that was really not even believed for quite a while, because it was just like, how could that be possible? But, you know, everyone works on a construct in their brain of how things actually function. That's important, because we don't know what's going on. We make a model, a theory it's called in science, and then we test that theory, and then we're like, well, this must be what's going on, and we publish a paper. But if you're wrong, like really wrong, like we are really a lot, because we
No,
are...
not my papers. Not my papers.
We're big time wrong. It's very difficult for a human to be different. Normally, if you're very different and you're right, you get the Nobel Prize 20 years later, right? Yes, yeah, wow. And so, so it's possible for machines to basically say, listen, something's going on here. Like we have this genetic background. We know genetically what's going on with cancer. We have oncogenes, we have all this understanding of what, but yet it still doesn't seem right, right? There's still other things going on. What is going on with these metastases? That's very complex. We see it, the scientists do see it. They see this new thing happening. If we can capture this data, and not, I was referring to kind of post-sick data, right? But in reality, the holy grail is to prevent cancer, right? We don't want it. Or early detection and good treatment. If we can start to gather a lot of this data, all the blood work that comes in when you're having a physical, when your child goes in to have a physical, all these things, that's never looked at in terms of, wow, this child's going to have a problem. You really need to keep them out of the sun. And right now we do is like, well, what happened to your family? Mm-hmm. But there's a lot more complexity around it than that, right? And so, I would say that's a big thing. So it's not just data that's kind of controlled by HIPAA, that we don't have the infrastructure to share because we don't have the security permissions, or we don't have the ability to maybe mine it or make sure that the patient consented correctly. All those things are very complicated because we don't have an infrastructure for that. But I also think modeling your whole life and looking at how can we keep you healthy? What's the best way? Do you need to run a mile a day, or do you need to run 5 miles a day, right? Do you need to eat grains or not eat grains in any way? And really, like Gene was saying, everybody is very unique, super unique. And not just based genetically unique, but bacterially unique, fungally unique. The organisms that live with us and make us who we are, we are just diving into that. It's super, again, I told you I was very excited about it because it's so exciting about finally kind of getting a better picture on what's going on. Because the modeling does seem to be working pretty well.
I just wanted, so one of the things that you said that makes me really excited that sits outside my domain is this idea of using AI actually from scientific findings, right? So you talked a little bit about how sometimes scientists have bias, sure. But then other times there's just this sheer volume of data. Like if you're an expert in, say, liver cancer or something, I'm making this up, I don't know this specifically, but you know, liver cancer or something, right? Then you might know nothing about cancer of a different body part, but yet if you did know some of that research, you'd be like, oh my gosh, there was this finding over here that might actually be helpful over here, but there's no, like a given human brain can't actually deal with that sheer volume of information. And so one of the most exciting things that, in preparation for the panel that I was reading about online that I thought was really cool, is this idea of using AI across scientific findings, which, like, but it seems to be a really interesting avenue for where AI can really change healthcare. Sits outside my area, but
I think, too, it would be writing the data so it could be used by AI. Right now, it's written for scientists, right? If you ever try to read a medical paper, or you try to go on the National Library of Medicine and look at PubMed and say, oh, how does this work? What's this drug exactly that the doctor told me to take? And you're like, wow, I don't know any of this. But it'd be pretty cool if you could ask your phone, and the phone would tell you all kinds of normal things, right?
So I'm jumping on the bandwagon. I'm excited. And I've had lots of coffee. But just to pull that thread again, I think one of the things that's both a challenge and an opportunity that we're seeing across all the different domains And I will shamelessly pander to the healthcare community. I'm not a doctor. I didn't play one on TV. I didn't even stay at a Holiday Inn. But MITRE has people working with it, and I get to work with them. But this notion of bias, on the one hand, human judgment is confounded by confirmation bias, recency bias, all these cognitive blinders that we all carry around, and just inundated with the sheer volume of data. So we need help. On the other hand, left to its own devices, instead of calling it machine learning, it'd be an interesting thought experiment when you see a brochure talking about some new capability enabled by machine learning. Replace that with high-performance linear algebra and see if you still think it's really, really exciting. The technology is real and it's remarkable, but we use terms that sometimes make us connect dots that aren't there in terms of judgment and et cetera. But the best simple illustration of this that I've seen, if you go to Google Translate, which is now completely a statistical machine learning application and is remarkable and is very, very good, and you enter in English, she is a doctor, he is a nurse, she is an engineer, and translate it to Turkish. Turkish, turns out, doesn't have gender in the pronoun. So then you translate that Turkish back to English. It will consistently and reliably say, he is a doctor, she is a nurse, he is an engineer. Now, that's not because anybody at Google is misogynist or they even thought about it. It's just the statistical correlation in the data that it used to train. That's just kind of a mildly irritating or sort of off-putting example. But translate that to consequential systems where it may not be obvious that's what's going on. That's the real challenge of getting this stuff right. And because it could, if done right, allow all kinds of opportunities to sift through data that no collection of humans can get through, to avoid confirmation bias and to avoid blind spots, but only if we deliberately sort of structure it from the start. And the pandering part is, not to forget, is there are a bunch of different communities, obviously, that are exploring the adoption of machine learning. The healthcare community, I think, is out front with respect to the sort of thought, care, and diligence that's being applied to basic principles. How do we gather data? What's the provenance? How far can we extrapolate this? There are some domains that are sort of leaping ahead without really thinking too much about the basics that you need to get in place first. And from an outsider's perspective, the healthcare community is doing a lot to establish standards, to calibrate different alternatives, to really build up the baseline so that as this stuff does get rolled out, there's increased confidence. So.
Yeah, and I just want to jump in real quickly here too, just that I feel like right now we're knocking down human brains as being confirmation bias and bad, but the human brain is still a phenomenal system, right? And put it against any AI and it's going to win more frequently in the sense of being able to adapt to context. There's still certain parts of human intelligence that we can't get into
Right.
AI and ML,
Right.
which is why, right, we have kind of a general societal concern, I think, even when you say, can this AI actually make this decision? Because do we think it's going to have sufficient sensitivity to what matters to humans? Because in the end, the only people that are really going to judge it are humans, right? And so I just don't want it to get lost in this conversation that the human brain is still, in and of itself, a fantastic problem-solving, creative, context-dependent decision maker, right? And so I think we just want to make sure that that also doesn't get lost, right, in the mixture of saying that AI can do certain things better. That's the argument we always make in the lab. AI can do certain things better,
Right.
process large volumes of data, hands down, no one disagrees. Let's make sure that we have AI that does that, but without losing the fact that there's a human component or a human cognition that still needs to be interspersed at the right time, whatever right is, right, in the process.
Yeah, it made me think that when Chuck said healthcare is moving along quickly, I think because there is this ultimate, the model is the doctor and the nurse, the healthcare providers are those human checks, right?
Yeah.
They can take this information, whether it's an AI scorecard or some kind of, a patient presents with a lung issue, how likely is it tuberculosis, how likely is it bronchitis, and they can see this information and go like, okay, well, I'm just going to give these 3 tests because those are the things it's most likely to be, as well as all my information from examining the patient, right? Mm-hmm. Providing more information. But I think it would be fun, too, to be able to say, all of us who have kids, you have this thing when your kids are little, like, do I take them to the doctor? Do I not take them to the doctor? It'd be awesome to be able to say, fever of 103, for the last 2 hours. It's 2 in the morning. Haven't given them Advil yet. Okay, don't give them Advil and then see how they're doing in 2 hours or something. That would be really cool. So almost like not super consequential, right? But helpful, because there's no doubt about it. You can't replace humans in the complexity of what we do, especially when it's a human-human interaction type thing, right?
And how is the National Cancer Institute partnering to get that data that's not just after an adverse event?
Well, that's a good question. I would say I say it's a good question because I really don't have a great answer. So we basically work with our grantees, and so we work with certain of the cancer centers that have they've moved forward. There's some big cancer centers like MD Anderson has large efforts in this. So generally we team with that. And then, believe it or not here, I'm definitely going to give some of the people who presented today a call, because there are these policy issues that need to be addressed with being able for these groups to share data, right? It's not possible for MD Anderson to send, even if a patient were to go from Texas to New York, MD Anderson is in Texas, and then if they were going to New York City, they'd go to Memorial Sloan Kettering. That's one of the cancer centers there. How can they get their records there, right? Even forget AI, just how do I get my records over to this other hospital? Well, we don't even have a solution for that today, right? The patient has to consent to that record transfer to the doctor. The doctor has to get authorized. So I would say I really look at the policy and informing my director to say we have a lot of technology. Let's not focus on technology. Let's focus on what are the things that are really causing the problem. I wish I could remember what somebody said it this morning. There are these bottlenecks, and we need to address those bottlenecks. We can do all this other stuff, but these bottlenecks are really caused by humans to address some issue. So, and that issue is one of patient protection from people misusing their health data. Remember I said, like, a lot of disease is genetic based, so there's a big giant concern that using normal techniques and maybe AI techniques, your family and your children and your descendants will become uninsurable, possibly. Because, like, no, you're going to cost us too much, we're not going to insure you. So, yeah, so there's great care to be taken with not sharing this data, but to me, it's really the first time I'm saying this publicly, there should be massive penalties for doing something like that. And really, there's not the structure in place to put those penalties in there. It's all about, no, don't share data because it might get stolen. It's like, well, why don't you really close the business that's trying to do this? Because we don't want that to happen.
But just in terms of someone from the Army Research Laboratory, there will always be adversaries. Yeah. Right? So, I mean, I think that's one of the really strongest challenges, right? Is even if, my research is directly related to trying to find ways where we can capture all of this data to improve and enhance performance, right? But my colleagues at the laboratory are always asking, where's the protection? It can be used, if you can use it for good, you can use it for evil. And just that tension is just, I don't have an answer.
Yeah, I was just going to say, one of the analogies we see a lot is between healthcare, for example, and the intelligence community. In both instances, the focus is on sort of collection and helping, not replacing, the analytic process and the communication of hypotheses and results and conclusions. But in the intelligence community, there are also all these barriers to sharing, et cetera. And one of the things that we run into is those weren't put in place capriciously. No one just woke up one day and said, let's block this. There's a good reason, usually, why a policy was created to prevent something or preclude something or make it difficult. And I think it's over and over again, whether it's defending against an adversary trying to get it, or the IRS worrying about people getting access to taxpayers' data, et cetera. So it ends up being sort of a complicated, nuanced, how do we have our cake and eat it too, to open up access or to open up some kind of proxy access or whatever.
I hate to break up the conversation.
We're excited.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
We're not going.
I wanted to leave a minute or two for some questions. So if anyone has any questions in the audience for our panelists.
Hi, Derek Oberdancing with Harper Page, and you brought up some stuff here with regard to AI and being able to understand what it's actually doing. have you guys been looking at the research into the explainability of the AI? And talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. So Gunning's work at DARPA, Explainable AI. There are other similar things at IARPA and a bunch of places. That's really important. I think the one caveat I guess I'd introduce is if you look at other high consequence systems, avionics, for example, explainable avionics, no one would say, well, that's great. As long as the avionics box can tell me why it signaled this flap to go down, we're all good. So there's a larger framework of sort of stakeholder consensus on what must never happen, what evidence would I have to bring to you to convince you that this system is mitigating that risk, et cetera. So explainable AI is a great set of very powerful tools put in the larger context of an end-to-end sort of system engineering view of what are we going to have to do to convince everybody it's okay to use this system. It's necessary but not sufficient. But yeah, we use a open source tool called Lime in some machine learning work that we're doing that allows you to understand why, for this particular classification, the system made that. So yeah, it's great work.
So if I can just, so at our work, we also are interested, so for example, if we're using brain data to try and predict performance, we do quite a bit of work, some of my colleagues do, on trying to find what are the actual features in the brain that are predictive, right? I was actually curious though, from your perspective, non-explainable AI isn't necessarily, I'm wondering if you think it's good or bad from the cancer perspective, right? Because from our perspective, if we want a technology that's going to improve performance, if we have a signal that allows us to predict performance, even if we don't understand the mechanism, say in the brain or body, it's not necessarily dire for us. But I would think in the cancer framework or in the medical framework, right, you'd have interactions across systems or across scales. It seems to be like there might be more of a focus for mechanistic, like the explainable AI within.
Mechanism.
So one thing that I think it's very important to understand is, especially for the National Cancer Institute, there's really two kinds of medicine that goes on. There's the clinical medicine that's FDA approved, and then there's clinical research. So what we do is we vet this work in the clinical research space with consented patients and very tight controls over what's going on. I would say it's more limited by the model. So there's a big study going on, and these are multiple of these going on, but for the National Cancer Institute, it's called the MATCH study. And basically, we take patients based on their disease and based on a lot of genetic factors, we match them with certain treatments. So that's all done in the clinical research side. So then we can kind of build these models to say, okay, because it's so complicated, right? We're only measuring 5 genes or 50 genes, so match measures about 500 genetic things as well as expression. Now we're starting to measure 1,000. So that means there's 500 we're not measuring for those patients that are going on. So I think it's just ongoing, and then you do the best you can with the right decision, and you hope that decision is better than the decision you made before. Our world too, we always have to remember we have a limited number of things we can do. So we can only treat you with so many things. So there's another large part of AI that the pharmaceutical companies are doing, and they're looking at how can we develop more treatments, right? Because we're limited by treatments. So yes, it is very complicated though.
All right, well, thank you guys so much. I hate to break up the conversation. Your enthusiasm is motivating. But please give our panelists a round of applause. Thank you.